You know, we all want to understand what is happening in the buyer's mind, right? But what if I told you that your buyer has 4 different minds and they all need to be understood? It's all about creating cognitive ease for your customer, and that's what we're going to talk about on today's episode of The Buyer's Mind.
Welcome to The Buyer's Mind, where we take a closer look deep inside your customer's decision-making mechanism to reverse engineer the perfect sales presentation. Now, please welcome your host, Jeff Shore.
Welcome, everyone, to The Buyer's Mind, where we investigate exactly what's going on in the brains of our prospects who are considering a purchase decision. And today, we're going to look at some of the complexities that our customers face and how we relieve some of that cognitive strain. This podcast is all about taking a stroll through the buyer's brain. It's about knowing the customer so well that that sale begins to roll out right in front of you. I'm your host, Jeff Shore. If you want information on the work we do at Shore Consulting, you can go to jeffshore.com. While you're there, check out our lineup of books, events, online products, everything you need to boost your sales career. As always, welcome to our show producer, Paul Murphy. Paul, how you doing?
Doing great today.
Hey, we're going to talk about cognitive ease today, and you know that we at Shore Consulting are constantly banging away on that same drum with that same mantra that easy equals right. So, Murph, do you have an example of that philosophy in the real world for you as a consumer?
Well, I think everybody uses Amazon, right? So it's really easy to search for what it is you want, and then when you go to purchase it, you just click on the buy and work your way through. I haven't tried the one-click buy yet, but I've used my credit card and done it that way. And
they do make it easy, right? They make it easy to understand. They make it easy to review. It's all right there. No wonder that they're gobbling up more and more market share all the time. But that's really what we're about here on The Buyer's Mind, is to try to figure out how do we make it easy for our customers to buy. But in order to do that, we've got to bring in that cognitive ease. We've got to make it easier on our customer's brain. And that leads us to our quote of the day from Deepak Chopra. Everyone uses the brain at every moment, but we use it unconsciously. We let it run in the background without realizing the power we have to reshape the brain. When you begin to exercise that power, the everyday brain, which we call the baseline brain, starts to move in the direction of the super brain. So what he's talking about here is something we've talked about before on The Buyer's Mind, the idea of this dual process theory, system 1 and system 2. System 1 of the brain working away in the background. System 2, what we think of when we think of thinking. It's the alert, aware thinking. But when we think about cognitive ease, there's really a combination here of brain anatomy, that is the way that the brain works, and emotional intelligence, another thing that we talk about quite a bit on The Buyer's Mind. The brain is so complex, and we well know that, but when we identify these healthy mental shortcuts for ourselves and for our customers, we create cognitive ease. We lessen cognitive strain, and that's what we're going to get into with our guest today. All right, hey, listen, make sure you stay tuned. We love to give stuff away, and we're going to give something away at the end of this very podcast. We want to let you know that the podcast is brought to you by our good friends at Home Street Bank. That is our show sponsor. That's also my lender of choice. I used Home Street in my last home purchase. I'll use it in my next home purchase. They're professional, dependable, great service, fantastic rates. If you're a real estate professional, you're looking for somebody to take care of your clients, you're not going to find anybody better than Home Street Bank. So whether it's banking, home loans, credit lines, you name it, go to homestreetbank.com to learn more. That's homestreetbank.com. Now, coming up in just a few minutes, an interview with Dr. Ryan Hamilton, a professor from Emory University, and we're going to talk about the 4 buying brains, or the buying minds, and how we manage those brains. Before we do that, we'll get to our tip of the day, and that is to describe things in 3s. Let me explain what I mean here. It's a technique called blocking. It's about getting your customer to reserve small compartments in their brain and offering them overview pieces of information a little at a time. It'll work best by an example. If I say to a customer, let me just explain the purchase process here. There are really just 3 things that you need to take in. Now, before I go any further, before I even think about what those three things are, what did I just do? I created cognitive ease, because my customer's response is to say, that's all I need to do is free up 3 compartments in my brain. 3, I can handle that. I've created an environment where they are more likely to listen and to listen attentively. Now all I need to do is just take the purchase process and divide it into 3 major categories. This is a technique called blocking, and for some reason, people understand easier in blocks of 3. So find something that stresses the customer out: the purchase process, the warranty, financing, feature selections, whatever it is. Present that in a block. There's really just 3 things you need to know. And when I start the sentence, when I start the description that way, there are just 3 things you need to know. What am I doing? I'm letting the customer know this is easy. And the mental shortcut that comes into play here, easy equals right. The easier something feels to me, the righter it seems to me. Hey, before we get to our interview, I want to tell you about an opportunity coming in December for real estate leaders and managers. It's the Sales Leadership Academy. This 2-day event will be held in Dallas on December 6th and 7th, but that's just where it begins. We then work you through an online course over the next 12 weeks to help you transform yourself and your sales team. We launched the Sales Leadership Academy, the first version, just a couple of months ago. It was so successful, we're going to do it again. So if you're interested in the Sales Leadership Academy, go to jeffshore.com/events to learn more. All right, well, let's get to our interview. Ryan Hamilton is a consumer psychologist whose research investigates shopper decision-making, obviously a good fit for our Buyer's Mind podcast. He's the author of The Intuitive Customer, a book on managing customer experiences. He's been published in scores of academic journals. He's been cited on NYT, WSJ, HBR, and a whole lot of other media sources with impressive acronyms. Moreover, Ryan Hamilton he's a genuinely good guy. We've enjoyed speaking. Joining us from Emory University in Atlanta, Professor Ryan Hamilton. Ryan, good to have you with us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Appreciate you having me on.
Give us the backstory. How did you first get involved in the interest and study of consumer behavior?
It is a long and illogical path that I took. I studied physics in college, which is about as far from consumer psychology as one can get on a map. Mm-hmm. And I went and worked in business, and I was honestly kind of down on psychology and marketing and sales. I thought they were all kind of fluffy subjects. And it wasn't until I was out there and actually working in the real world that I realized that no, that was in fact where the action was, that was what really was interesting to me, is just, what do people find persuasive? How do people make decisions? And so when I went back to graduate school, that's what I opted to study.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. You picked a good subject just from the sense that it is a constantly evolving field of study, and we think about what we have learned, what science has learned, what academics have learned in the last 20 years has probably trumped anything that we learned for thousands of years up to that point.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, part of what drew me to the topic is the fact that it is ever evolving. As you say, it feels like the best time to study these topics ever. We're kind of in the golden age of understanding decision making and behavioral economics becoming popular, and not just in the academic communities, but people out there in the real world are starting to get really excited by these topics and wanting to know what they can do with them.
Yeah, I think that's why I found our conversation so interesting, Ryan, because there's the idea of the whole field of behavioral economics has really taken root in the academic world, but it hasn't really translated well yet into the business world, into the commercial application. And it seems that every day there's a new theory for how the brain works, how it processes information, ultimately how it makes a decision. And that's kind of a problem because too many theories that sometimes conflict with one another. It all gets kind of jumbled up and we don't even know what to believe. I know this is something that's intriguing to you.
Yeah, it is. So it's been fun to be where I am. So I'm an academic. I spend my days developing and testing theories, but I'm also a marketing professor. So I teach MBA students. I interact with a lot of business executives, and it's only been in the last several years that I've kind of poked my hole more and more out of the ivory tower. Mm-hmm. and started to sense some of the frustration coming from people who actually want to try to benefit from this knowledge. On the academic side, we're happy to just spin out new theories all the time. That's how we're incentivized. Mm-hmm. That's how we keep our jobs. But on the practitioner side, if you're trying to use this stuff, then all of the new theories that are coming out are not helping you. They're just frustrating. And to the point that you just made, some of them conflict with each other. Mm-hmm. So you have theory A that says that in this situation you should raise price, and theory B in this situation you should lower price. And it's not like one of them is wrong. Mm-hmm. They will often both be right. It becomes a matter of when are they right? Under what circumstances are they right? So more recently, I've started to spend some time trying to bridge that gap a little bit, trying to help people understand not just what these theories are, but also when would they be most useful for them.
You know, it's one of the reasons why I so appreciate people like you who are standing in that gap and trying to figure out how do we take what we know, valuable information that it is, and make it approachable for people who do not read white papers and journals and scientific research. And so when I think, for example, of, you know, Dr. Robert Cialdini and his book on influence theory, and if I look at it and go, okay, if you are likable, you are more likely to be in a position of influence. That's something I can get my head around. It's easy, it's simple, it's straightforward. But I think we need to see a whole lot more of that. And that's why I want to talk to you about this paper that you wrote, The 4 Minds of the Customer. It's a framework for understanding and applying the science of decision making. I've read it twice. It's highly underlined. It's absolutely amazing. Give us the overview first, just the executive summary, The 4 Minds of the Customer.
Sure. So the approach that we took with the 4 Minds framework is we started by looking at all this decision-making theory, good theory, validated theory, stuff that's been tested over and over again over the decades. And we tried to say, all right, is there a way that we can group these theories together in such a way that we could say, okay, if you find yourself in this setting, you should use theory group A, because that'll help you. Or if you're in this setting over here, use theory group B. So we've defined these 4 different groups of theories, what we call the 4 minds. And the idea is that these are 4 ways, common ways, that all of us make decisions. And so if you can figure out, well, what are the factors that are likely to influence my customer's decision, you can be more likely to be drawing your insights from the right theory for you. So the 4 minds that we identified are what we call the ideal point mind. And that really quickly is situations where people know exactly what they want, and so they're just going to make comparisons until they find something that's close to it. The market comparison mind, this is where people tend to focus on just a couple of key attributes, and trying to determine whether that attribute is good or not is based largely on what's available in the marketplace. Local comparison mind, this is where people tend to focus on what's in front of them and are trying to pick the best out of what's available. And then the image mind. And that is a mindset where people are relying less on kind of the numbers and the attributes and more on their general impressions. And with those 4 minds or approaches, if you can figure out which type of decision making your customer is likely to engage in, then it points you towards a direct approach. So can I give you an example?
Of course.
So let's assume that you want to know how your customer is going to evaluate your price, right? You're going to go and sell to this customer, and you're going to go at them with this particular price, and you want to know how are they going to evaluate that price? Well, you could be selling to a customer who has been buying in this industry, in this area for a very long time. They're an expert customer. They know exactly what they want. They're very experienced. The way they're going to evaluate your bid is by comparing your price and all the other options all the other characteristics of your offering, and comparing it to that ideal point. And so they may only need to evaluate a couple of bids, because if they find one that's very close to exactly what they knew they wanted, they can stop looking, right? They'll get right to it. So for this type of customer, it becomes very important for you to know what is that ideal point. What is it that they're looking for if you want to sell to them? If we look at the other extreme, the image mind, this would be people who primarily are not experts in the field, who may have a hard time evaluating options, or who just don't care that much because it's not important for them. And so they might come to you, and when they're evaluating your price, they might look to your brand. Well, is your brand pretty reasonable in terms of prices? Well, then I'm just going to assume that this price is reasonable. And they're going to make their decision that way. For selling to that type of customer, coming at them with a lot of facts and numbers and assessments, that's not going to convince them. They were convinced or not convinced before you even started talking based on your reputation, based on your brand. So figuring out ahead of time which of these two types of customers you're dealing with is going to save you a lot of time and give you a lot of insights in the sales process.
There is something of look, we could unpack all of this and be here all day. We simply don't have the time. So I'm going to want to focus in on one. I'm going to dive into the local comparison mind. Before we do that, as we think about the four different minds, there is something of a scale that we could look at here, at least the way that I'm seeing it, that suggests we're moving from the ideal point mind, which is much more of a logical, technical, sort of left brain activity, all the way over to the image mind, passing through market comparison and local comparison, and we're kind of moving from more of an analytical approach to more of an emotional approach. Is that a fair way to categorize the four minds?
Yeah, that is a fair way of characterizing it. We tried to distinguish these four mindsets or approaches in a number of different ways. And one of the ways that we did it in the paper is just what you suggested. We pointed out that these differ in terms of kind of effort and accuracy, these different ways of making decisions. So on average, the more effort you put into a decision, the more important it is to you, the more you care about it, the more likely you're going to be towards this high effort ideal point end of the scale. And then as it becomes less effortful, as you're willing to maybe tolerate a little bit more risk or error in your decision, then you're going to move down that scale towards the image mind, which tends to be the easiest way of making a decision. Kind of, how do I feel about this? I feel good. All right, let's go for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. And so if maybe a good example of that would be looking at just that impulse item. It's not particularly straining on your budget. There are not a lot of reasons to say no. You feel good about it. You don't even really think about it. You just kind of buy it. But if you're thinking about it, but if you're thinking about installing, solar in your house and it's going to cost you, $25,000, and you don't really know how it works, and you're not sure how long it's going to take to get it paid off, and you want to do your part for the environment, but you're not like all in on that concept. Now you're really having to grind in order to make that decision.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting the way that you approach that. So if you decide you want to buy solar panels, but you're not really sure what else to do, and you go to a solar panel retailer, mm-hmm. which I'm going to just assume exists for the purpose of this example.
They do. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Solar panel world, mm-hmm. And you just look at what they've got available and you're like, all right, this one looks better than those, then that would be a local comparison way of doing this. If you really educate yourself and decide this is exactly what I want, this is what I want it to look like, this is what I want it to be able to do in terms of output and in terms of cost, then you may have formed an ideal point, and use that to make your decision. So
I want to look very closely, again, because we simply don't have the time to look at all these. Let's focus in on the local comparison mind. Right. So, this is that local comparison mind, that a part of us that's looking at basically what is right in front of me. And you talk about context effects that are critical to understanding how the local comparison mind works. So give us an example of a local comparison mind in action.
Sure. Yeah. So just to reiterate, local comparison is when you are limited to the set of options ahead of you. You can think of maybe the way you make a decision with regards to a dessert at the end of a meal, right? You tend to focus on that dessert menu. It doesn't matter if you've got an ideal dessert out there somewhere in your brain. Mm-hmm. You're picking one of these 6 desserts. That's what you're going to go with. And so the key insight with regards to a local comparison mind is that people are really trying to choose the best from whatever set they've got. That means they're making a lot of comparisons within whatever's in front of them. So it might be on the store shelf, it might be on the menu, it might be with regard to several bids that were submitted and that they're comparing. So local comparison is really about that comparison. So how do I choose which one of these? So there's been a lot of research on this. As I said, each of these minds draws on research going back 40 or 50 years. And within this context effect stream of research, there have been a number of these effects that have been identified. One of them that would be relevant is extremeness aversion. So it turns out that people often will like to choose kind of a middle or compromise option. Not all the time, but that's a pretty common way of making a decision. I give you a set of 3 options. One is very high priced and very high quality. One is very low priced and low quality. Chances are you're going to go for the middle option. So if you know that your customer is going to be making a local comparison decision, if you know that they're going to tend to focus on the options that are in front of them, for instance, if you know that they've submitted several requests for proposal and that yours is one of 3 or 4 that are coming in, it's going to be really important that you are optimal with regards to those other options. And in particular, it's usually going to make sense for you to try to be somewhere in the middle, some kind of compromise option, rather than too extreme on any attribute, because that could become a deterrent for somebody who's making a decision using a local comparison mind.
It seems to me the best example I can think of right here is looking at the wine list at a restaurant.
Yep.
I mean,
a great example,
right? You see that. I've heard the stories, the studies that the best-selling wine is also is always the second least expensive on the menu, right? Nobody wants the extreme of the cheapest bottle, but they figure if they move up one, well, there you go.
Yeah. So that's exactly this extremeness aversion, and you would expect to find that among people who make a decision using a local comparison mind, because there you're focused on that wine list. You don't want to reveal yourself to be a real cheapskate in front of your date. So you're not going to choose the cheapest wine. At the same time, you don't care that much. But it's important to note that not everybody makes a decision that way, right? So if you were a wine connoisseur, you were probably an Ideal Point customer. You know exactly what you want with your wine, and so you're not going to choose that least second, the cheapest bottle.
Right.
But for people in that local comparison mind, then the set becomes very important. So if you're the restaurateur, you get to determine which bottle of wine is the second cheapest, right? So if you're the salesperson, and you're dealing with this local comparison mind, you get to construct that set in such a way that you can steer people towards one option or another. In particular, realizing people will tend to avoid the extreme options.
Let's talk a little bit about compromise and where compromise comes into this, because when we're making a purchase decision, and it doesn't matter what the product is, but when we're making a purchase decision, typically we're not going to get everything that we want, especially for a major decision. So if I'm buying I can't imagine that everybody who is buying, a Toyota Camry is driving their absolute, if money were no object, dream car, right? So there is always compromise that comes into play when we're going to make a decision. How does the 4-mind concept, the 4 minds of the customer, how do we see compromise take its place? Because compromise is really an emotional thing. Does it still affect somebody who's, for example, an Ideal Point type of buyer?
It's a great question. I think you can characterize the last 50 years of decision-making research as trying to answer exactly that question. How do people deal with making trade-offs? How do they deal with this forced compromise that they have to go through? And the way that I would say the 4 minds framework helps is that it characterizes 4 different approaches we have for making those trade-offs. So again, focusing back on the local comparison mind, since that's what we wanted to talk more about. Often the way that we will negotiate those trade-offs in a local comparison mind is by trying to simplify the decision in some way. So we're not going to typically do an exhaustive analysis and comparison of every attribute for every option. if we're in that local comparison mind. We're going to try to look for reasons for choosing one option over the other. So, for example, is this one the compromise option? It is. That's a pretty good reason for choosing it. And so, well, I should rephrase that. That's a pretty common reason for choosing it. I don't know that it's necessarily a good reason.
Right.
Is this option better than one of the other options in the set? Like, clearly better. It is? Well, that's a reason for choosing it. This kind of reason-based approach for negotiating trade-offs is one that's going to be more common for local comparison shoppers, customers, than it will be for other types of decision-making minds.
We're just about out of time, but what's rattling through my brain as I'm thinking through all of this very, very heady concept is the battle between logic and emotion. Can you just sort of talk philosophically about that and about what the customer experience is? Because as I'm going through the four minds of the customer, I'm seeing such a heavy presence of both, and yet there's so much of the time a huge conflict between logic and emotion. Just talk about the role of logic and emotion, how they play together, and ultimately what we need to pay attention to.
Sure. As you mentioned earlier on, I think that while both logic and emotion would be at play in all four decision-making lines, I think that's everybody is both logical and emotional all the time. I think we can characterize maybe the degree to which people are more one or the other, or maybe more influenced by one type of decision-making or the other. And the scale, the spectrum that you talked about earlier, where we have ideal point, which is going to tend to be a little bit more on the hard-nosed, rational, cold, calculating trade-off side, and image mind, which, because it's relying on these overall impressions, is going to tend to be more on kind of that qualitative or emotional, intuitive side.
But wait, let me jump in there for just a second, though, because if nobody's going to look at it with an ideal point perspective and say, you know what, I've run the numbers, and this home that I'm looking at here, boy, I got to tell you what, on a $1 per square foot basis, looking at the comps that are out there, looking at the very specific needs that I have, this seems that's all ideal point thinking. But if I'm looking and saying, I just freaking hate this house. This is the ugliest house that I've ever seen in my life. But the numbers work, so I'm going to buy it. That seems to be an error right there. In other words, there's an emotion at play.
It's an interesting philosophical question. So what would you consider to be an error?
Well,
this is, and I'm not trying to trap you here. This has been defined several different ways by different research streams.
Yeah.
When you say it would seem to be an error, what do you have in mind there?
Well, if I've got somebody who's evaluating something with an ideal point mind, they're still not going to buy it if they think it's ugly. That's the error. The error is in the conflict there. Or is it an ideal point mind and an image mind working together at the same time?
I gotcha. Yeah. So we tried to create as much distance between these minds as we could for the purposes of helping people understand. I would say that the fact that a house is ugly and that drives your decision making is not necessarily inconsistent with an ideal point mind. So it could be that among the attributes that you consider when you think about your house, a certain look is an attribute that you could evaluate. You could come up with a way of rating houses on ugliness, and so that could kind of factor into your consideration. If the ugliness of the house leads you to kind of believe, then it's probably not very kept up very well on the inside, so I'll probably have to spend a lot in repairs, or maybe I don't trust the neighborhood if the neighbors aren't willing to step in and do something about a house this ugly, right? You could draw lots of additional conclusions about the house based off of this one image-based attribute, kind of the ugliness. So that's how I would characterize those two different approaches. I think that both of them can influence any of these minds. It's just a matter of how something like the ugliness of the house would influence your decision making. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. We know the concept that in the form of, if you will, a psychological hack, for lack of a better term, that easy equals right. In the mind of a customer, the easier something seems to me, the righter it feels to me. And you have suggested that when we move over to the image side and to a lesser extent the local comparison mind, that's an easier way for us to process our decisions and for us to actually make the decision. Should sales professionals be attempting to move people down that scale, or is it just a matter of, look, it's going to be more effortful in the ideal point mind or the market comparison mind? That's just the way it is. Should we be attempting to move people into that cognitive ease framework?
This is my favorite question to get, because it focuses on the approach that I advocate to marketing and sales, which is the recognition that people are different. I think that as basic a concept it is, when I talk to companies when they're having problems, the most common reason is because they're neglecting their segmentation and treating customers as if they're all the same. So I would say if there may be opportunities to shift people in one direction or another, I would say that it's more useful to try to figure out where your customers are. I love the fact that you brought up the old saw about making it easy and how easy is better. And it's an old saw for a reason, because it's usually true. It's a good piece of advice. But there's also that hesitancy of, is it always true? And like anything, I would say that it's not. I think that there are groups of customers for whom making it harder in terms of giving them more information, in terms of giving them more opportunities to think their way through problems, is going to help, even if on average it's a bad thing. And so it becomes this question of, can I figure out when? Can I figure out how are my customers making decisions? Recognizing that there are going to be different groups that make decisions in different ways.
We are just about out of time. So one last question here. Advice for a sales professional who finds the topic really interesting on an intellectual basis, but is struggling right now to try and figure out, how do I apply it? Give us one piece of advice for what we can do, even if it's just or what we can think that would give us a good starting point.
Sure. So we go into a little bit more detail in the white paper, which is online, but the really short version that you can think about, try to consider how important is this decision to your customer and how informed are they? That'll get you a lot of the way towards some of the insights that we have in the white paper. It's so easy for us in sales and marketing to overshoot in terms of how important this decision is to our customer, because it's so important to us. We spend all our time thinking about these products, thinking about this sales process, and for some of our customers, this sale might be very important to them. It might be the biggest purchase that they make all year. It might be key to their success in their company. But a lot of the stuff that we sell, it's just not as important to the customer as it is to us. So if that's the case, there's a mismatch. And you can't think about, well, what would I find compelling when thinking about my offering with respect to my customers and my competitors? It becomes important to take their perspective. If it's just not that important to them, well, then what are the ways that they are making that decision easier for themselves? Can you get inside their mind and take their perspective and persuade them in a way that will resonate with them? Kind of speak in the language of the decision that they're making.
Love it. He is Professor Ryan Hamilton. You can go to his website, mindingmarketing.com, to see more. Great stuff. Ryan, can't thank you enough. That was fascinating.
Oh, it was a real pleasure. I appreciate that you're doing this podcast. I've listened to several, and it's a great service translating this arcane academic stuff that's not meant to be consumed by human beings into something that's actually usable. So.
Appreciate that. We'll have you on again. We'll dive in deeper. Thanks so much. All right, so there you have it. Dr. Ryan Hamilton with some really, really cool stuff. And I don't know how you were feeling as you went through this, Murph, but as I was looking at these 4 different types of brain. I was applying myself into that picture. And it all made sense to me. I've had times where I've had that ideal brain, and I have had times where it was more of the image brain or the local comparison. Were you putting yourself in the story the same way?
I was, and I really liked the idea of talking about the local mind and picking that bottle of wine. That was a great example for me because that's where I'm at. But, I'm also an ideal point mind guy, depending on what it is we're talking about. If we're talking about tech and electronics, I'm an ideal point mind guy. So, yeah, I could see each of those four minds as we were describing them. It was a great visual.
Yeah. But if you're standing in a Best Buy or a Fry's Electronics somewhere, and you're an ideal point mind, and you know what you want and you know what you need, and you got a salesperson who's like, "Oh, look at this! Look at the styling on this packaging! Isn't it sexy?" It's got to be able to just completely turn you off in a hurry because he's speaking in a different mind than you're thinking, right?
Yeah, well, my mind shuts down. He's useless to me because he's not where I'm at.
Well, the converse would also be true, right? If I'm out shopping for a car, I'm not a technical guy. I am absolutely looking for how I feel about the car, how much I like the car. So when somebody gets into engine specs, that might work for an ideal point buyer, but it's not going to work for me. So it's so powerful to be able to look at it from that side and recognize that your customer, even at different points of the sale, might be in different frameworks in their mind. But if we don't understand that, boy, are we going to get in trouble. And I just want to encourage everybody here. We have posted the link to that white paper for those four minds. We've posted it in the show notes. And I want to encourage you to download that and read through it. It's really interesting. And Ryan Hamilton uses some really good everyday examples that will help you to get a better sense of the four buying minds and how you can adapt your sales presentation accordingly. Well, let's head into the wrap up here. We've been talking about cognitive ease today and how to make it easy for a customer to buy. And one of the things that we know about the brain is that stress constricts creativity. All right, stress constricts creativity. The more stressed out our customers are, the more difficult it is to make a decision because decisions are made out of the creative side of the brain. So if there's an abundance of stress, it's very, very difficult to get to that decision. That's why we wanted to have Ryan Hamilton on the show. That's why we've had others who have spoken similarly about the need to reduce that level of stress. So there's an application to your customer, but right now, I just want to talk about you. And I would ask you the question, what are you doing to lower your own stress? Because not only does stress constrict creativity, but there's another attribute of stress you need to understand, and that is it's contagious. It's transferable, whether we want it to or not. We pick up the stress of people around us, and if you are stressed, your customer will see it. They will know it. So my question is, what are you doing to manage your own stress? And I want to just add one tip here for you. Build some margin into your life. I just think we get so busy, we get so stretched that there's no margin. I'm talking about time margin so you don't overpack your schedule. I'm talking about relational margin. I'm talking about financial margin, energy margin. What do you do so that you're not stressing everything out and just filling everything up? We need that time to be able to step away. We need to be able to build those little blocks in there. Years ago, I wrote a book called Margin. That was the name of the book. I don't remember the author's name, but we'll put it in the show notes. But I have to tell you, it was a very powerful book and very convicting book for me to look at it and say,
sorry, Dr.
Henry Cloud, thank you very much. Murph coming through right there. It was such a powerful book for me to look at it and say, where am I overloading all these areas of my life? But when you build in some margin, it lowers your stress level. Hey, at the beginning of the podcast, I told you there'd be a giveaway. Today's giveaway is a copy of my book, Closing 2.0. This is a sort of a 30-day journey for you to understand not just closing theory, but your closing technique and how to do it in a way that's very buyer sensitive. The book will transform your ability to ask for the sale. It's powerful, and we're developing an entire training academy that will open this fall around the content. But for a chance to get a copy right now, just go to our Facebook page, like the page, then find the quote from today's podcast, and in the comments, enter the hashtag Buyer's Mind. We'll pick a winner at random. Just go to facebook.com/Jeff Shore Community. All right. Hey, well, listen, we're going to ask you, as always, if you're loving the podcast, let other people know about it. The podcast is growing through word of mouth, and that's exactly what we are hoping for. So tell somebody else, put it on your Facebook page, let people know where they can find The Buyer's Mind. That's a wrap on today's episode. Hope you enjoyed it. You can find everything you're looking for at jeffshore.com. But until next time, go out there and change someone's world.